So I'm mostly going to be talking today about, everybody here all right?
Yep.
All right. I'm mostly going to talk about vertical sliding window sashes, wooden window sashes. Of course, there's casement sashes, there's medieval shutters or whatever you've got. But this thing right here, which is half finished, that's a vertical sliding sash. So it's going to move up and down in a groove, right? And typically there's two of these. The earliest examples, the top one was fixed. Top sash wouldn't move, the lower sash would open and close. And because large panes of glass were expensive, you got glazing bars to separate, divide the lights, so you can use smaller pieces of glass. So that's the technology we're going to be discussing today, because that right there is the pinnacle of wooden window technology in the West. These originated either in France or in Holland sometime in the 17th century. The first English one that we know about was installed in the 1670s. And if any of you know about the architect Christopher Wren, his master joiner was the one who documented the use of counterbalanced vertical sliding wooden window sashes. And they remained in use in America and England and other parts of the world until very recently, in the grand scheme of things, until the 1940s or 50s is when we really started switching over from wood to metal or whatever, aluminum, eventually vinyl. But here's the difference, the thing that sets wood apart from those other materials that most of us probably have in our houses. It is endlessly repairable. It is naturally renewable. With proper care, a wooden window can last 300 years and function as well as it did when it was new. And if it's properly updated, weather stripping, well fit and all of that, and a storm window, it can be almost as or as energy efficient as a vinyl window. That's not necessarily a terribly well-known fact. All right, so the other reason this is relevant, and mostly relevant to us, is because these window sashes, as compared to the earlier leaded casements or those earlier shutters, things like that, these are what drove the trade to develop specialized tools. That's why most of us are here, is those unique tools to unique jobs. So these became very popular into the 18th century, and they were being made in much larger quantities. You had better accessibility to that kind of building, to glass panes that were large enough to fit into these. So we start to have specialized tools. So I'm going to talk about those tools a little bit. Let me see where my notes are. We're going to move through the parts, pardon me. We're going to move through the parts of the window, starting with the frame, which I haven't built yet. These windows are going to be installed in my shop. I haven't got to that part yet. But I got a sample here of a window jamb. There's a couple of specialized tools that go into quickly and efficiently producing the jambs of a sash window. And they mostly have to do with the pulley pockets or the sill. So these sashes, at their most advanced, are counterbalanced. Say this is your lower sash, there we are. It'll have a cord running up over a pulley into the jamb down to a couple of weights, right? So you can lift it and lower it with ease and it'll stay put. In order to do that, you've got to fit the pulleys into the jamb. That's pretty rudimentary. There's little turn pulleys, they're on a metal pin. They've got to be pretty close to the top so you get the full weight or full range of motion. But you've got to be able to access those pulleys after the window's built in and the jamb's nailed to the building in order to retie them, replace them, remove them, whatever. So in order to do that, quickly and efficiently in the process of building, joiners would need to cut out a pocket to access those pulleys. So you're standing inside the building. This is the jamb next to the window. That groove, if you can all see the groove down the middle of that little board, that's for the parting bead. That's going to set in there and keep the sashes in line vertically. So that bead's our stop when we go to cut this out. And this is the most common way to remove that pocket, is just take a piece out of one side of the jamb where the front will be covered by the interior casing. I don't have my picture up of what a window looks like, so you have to use your imagination. But so you can get in there with a saw, and I tried that to start with. just to take your sash saw or your carcass saw, and you can make a stopped cut. You can connect diagonally from the front to the parting bead groove there, and you can sort of work your way down into the corner. Now that takes a light touch, it takes good control, it takes practice, and it takes a little bit of time not to bind your saw or kink the end of it. So there's a faster way, and if you'll bear with me for a moment, I'm going to set up another piece like this to demonstrate. Doing it all by hand. We're going to take this piece here. All right, we might get some pictures soon. This plow plane from Matt Borders, Griffiths of Norwich. It's only got one little thing. There's no lobe on the wedges. So I've got to replace those, thank you. But they work. So we're going to plow a little groove there to mimic that parting bead groove. All right. Somebody hand me a broom after we're done here. I'll get that. Let's see. Set it a little deeper. This is one of the non-specialized tools that's still absolutely essential to making window sashes and window jambs, is the plow plane here. Oops, that's good enough. All right, so there's our simulated window jamb with our groove for our parting bead. Now here's the trick. The trick is to have your tools out before the demonstration. Here's the trick. You want this thing to set in there, the same piece that we took out, save ourselves the time, effort, and the material of making a cover for the pocket, right? That's why we're trying to expedite this process. You've got to be able to remove it, but it's got to be able to set in there nice and neat. So that's on the face. Here's what we're going to do. On the top, we're going to cut it in at an angle. This has another benefit to it. As that sash is sliding down, if that pocket isn't flush and tight in there, that slanted top means the slash will just keep on sliding. It won't hit it and stop. That's also going to make it easier to remove. And then on the bottom, we're going to put in a step. Think about this here. There it is. All right, now this may be difficult to see, but we've got a shoulder on the inside facing the pulley pocket, if that makes sense. We got the same thing up here at the top. Well, what am I talking about? I got another one right here. There we are. So this slides up in there, butts up at the bottom, and then you can toenail it down in there. That's how it's going to fit in. Is that easy enough to see? The shape of that there. All right, so we're going to make a couple of cuts. Now, like I said, I could bring that saw down into that groove using it as the stop, but it's going to be a little trickier. So what I'm going to do instead, try not to cut into Matt's work. We're going to cut diagonally just from where it'll stop up to the parting bead. That's an angle cut. Practicing the ancient joiner's art of the short stroke. I have a lot of elbow room here. All right, so here's the trick. This is the special tool. There it is. That tool makers came up with to sell to joiners to make this thing easier. This is a sharpened putty knife. The reason I've got that is because the example I brought today of an original 19th century Sash pocket chisel is a beautiful example. Hibernia works, William Marples and Sons, London pattern handle. These are not the rarest of tools, but they're not the most common. I wouldn't dare. Also, this is borrowed. So that's my example there. I have photos of it somewhere, but now I'm rolling and I'm not sure I want to stop to pull up pictures. You're all welcome to come up and look at these. I'll set them out somewhere once I'm done talking. I'm happy to talk about them after the presentation, especially for those folks all the way back there. But that's our Sash pocket chisel. It's very thin in the blade. And it's sharpened on both sides so that it won't change direction as you're hammering in there, right? It's a double bevel. So that's the tool. But who knows? Maybe the first iteration of that was a sharpened putty knife. So we've got a partial cut diagonally between those two, right? Ideally not to mar the face in there, which I did. So we're going to take this chisel and finish the cut. And that works all right. And fast. And it fits down in that saw curve. And we have to do the same thing from the other side. But this raises another question entirely, because the backside doesn't have a groove for a parting bead. So what we'll do to connect those, because we don't just have to remove this, do we? We have to remove the side as well. We have to separate it so it can come out. Well, there's a trick for that too. These are normal tools, but it's not something that would necessarily come directly to mind. Let's see here. All we need is the location of the parting groove, pretty roughly. There we are. I'm going to take that little center bit. I'm not going to bore all the way through. I'm just going to bore deep enough to where it hits the parting groove, effectively piercing through without showing on the inside of the jam. That's good enough. Just at the top and bottom of the pocket cover. There we are. Like so. Not showing all the way through. Maybe you can see the projector light there. Now, we've got to separate those. Using a compass saw or a pad saw. Up that nice little turn screw today. Hibbard Spencer cast steel, pretty good. There. All right. Using parting groove as the guide. Wrong side. Great news, folks.
Yeah.
Well, this is only the second time I've used this saw. The first time I used it, it went all right.
Slow down when you're going too fast.
That's good advice. Let's see here.
Oh, saw out there.
Yeah. Maybe we can finish that cut still. This is something I've wondered before. You ever in an antique store or sorting through the piles and you find a compass saw with a blade like that? You got to ask yourself, who left it that way? Was it somebody playing with it, some kid, years after its last user? Might have been the last user. You never know. All right. Finish these back cuts. While I was researching and learning how to use this tool, I went to set up the sash pocket, and I make stop cuts for dados and things like that all the time with the saw. So I went ahead and did that, and then was sitting there wondering what this thing's even for, because I'd already done the whole thing. And then I tried it again after I read again with this, and it's 3 times faster. It's much better. Okay, now to remove that, all we've got connecting these two, in theory, is a little bit of short grain on each of those. So we're gonna come from the back, and we're gonna do that.
Split it in.
Couldn't you have done that with a karate chop?
That's how I earned my 2nd degree black belt in Taekwondo. So,
Yeah.
this worked the first time. I didn't go deep enough with the pocket chisel. That's what I did there. So I thought I'd start off today with something that I've only done once before, that I think most people, even those who build wooden sash windows, have probably never done. I thought that would get us off to a good start, break the ice a little bit. Okay. But that's just one tool in the whole collection of specialized tools for making a window sash. The only other tool relevant to the frame, where's that laptop? Is a sill plane. And you may have seen these before if you're a plane collector. It's an odd looking plane, and they've got a couple of different configurations. What it comes down to is you've got a little round blade that's cutting sideways, flush with the sole, if that makes sense. We're gonna try to pull up a picture, thank you. Let's see. And it's an interesting plane because it's been misattributed in its use many times. Usually, people look at it and they see that it's labeled a sash sill plane or something like that, or a sill drip plane, and they expect that it's used to cut the drip groove on the underside of an overhanging sill. Because you got water running down that sill, and if it doesn't have that groove, the water's gonna run back up the underside, up into your building, right? So you put a groove down on the bottom of that sill. But you do that on the bench with the sill free with the plow plane. That's how you make that groove. So what is this other plane even for? And especially, why is it round? Just making a groove. It can be square, it doesn't need to be round. Let's see if we can pull this up. And as was the case with a lot of this research, the people who had the answers turned out to be English country joiners who are still practicing the trade in the 19th century tradition professionally. And a few of them have been generous enough to make videos and posts of those processes and those tools. And one of them, this isn't working, one of them, excuse me, there, gave this thing its English name, which is also in the books by John Whalen. And Jane Reese's article, which was a basis for this presentation, was an excellent article by Jane Reese about sash making tools. And they call it a throating plane. And what it's for is on a properly made formal sill, not the vernacular sills that I mostly work with at Connor Ferry. You're gonna have the run of the sill from the outside edge up towards the window, and then behind the sash, you're gonna have a little a rise. It's gonna step up and then go into the building behind the lower sash. But that's another spot where you can have water come up under the sash and creep its way into the building. So what they do is take this odd little plane with a stock here and a blade here and cut that little undercut that would stop the water from creeping up. It fights the capillary action and makes the sill that's more resistant to admitting water. I really hope I can get this figured out. That's my problem, isn't it? Okay. Excuse me. Some technical difficulties. At my day job, I spend most of my time in the 19th century. I enjoy using hand tools, but most of the time, I'm also restricted to hand tools. Almost got it. Okay, thank you. There we are. Okay, if we can only get this connected, thank you. That's the article. You'll have to bear with me on my iPad. I could see these images before I opened them. This will be interesting. Okay. Well, how do we do that? There. All right. Sorry for the delay. Now we can look at some cool pictures. Let's see. All right. So that odd little plane that I was just talking about, a sill plane. Where? I know there's one in here. It's still loading images. Oh, there. This image is from a book by Peter Nicholson in the early 19th century, who was a practicing joiner in England and also wrote a couple of excellent books for laymen about the trades of joinery and carpentry and other trades. But he was a trained joiner, and he had these engravings made of architectural components. So, can you see the cursor? Excellent. That's what we're talking about right there. That thing right there. This sill is a solid piece. And it's got this cut in to make the rise on the outside. The lower sash falls down over that step, and there's a little cut underneath to keep the water from crawling up into the building. This plane is for the purpose of creating that groove. And here's one. And a diagram from Jane Reese's article. That's only one configuration that was made by Charles Nurse, manufactured in London. And it's got a weird little sneck to the end of the iron to cut that groove in. That's one of the few commercially manufactured examples. Many of them were craftsman made. If I can see these pictures, find an image I saved, one of those. I'll get used to this and this whole thing will pick up. Let's see here. Here's the answer, we'll go straight to the source. There we are. There, that's what I wanted to look at. These are two craftsman-made sill planes. I have a particular interest in craftsman-made tools, which I learned from Bruce Cox. And this is typical of those craftsman-made examples. Rather than an oddly shaped, weirdly ground iron to cut that undercut, they just opened up the mortise onto the sole of the plane. Can you see that there? That's the wedge open to the side, so that that iron is flush with the sole of the plane to ride on the sill and cut it underneath. All right. Well, that shows it off much better than I can explain it verbally. Excellent. Okay. That's one I don't have an example of yet. So that covers the frame. You've got rudimentary tools being used. The frames were pretty simple in the 19th century. They were nailed together at the corners. They're being nailed into the building, and you didn't want to waste any time on those if you could help it. They weren't the most skilled part of the process. Let's put this nice picture up there for now. So moving on to the sashes, this is where it gets really interesting. Pardon me. So with any project, you're going to start by laying it out, marking out the joints. And in the course of my research, I came across one of those English joiners is also a tool collector and a tool historian named Richard Arnold, who's active on social media. Some of you might have seen his posts. If you're in any of the Facebook groups for wooden planes, you'll see his posts frequently. It's his birthday today. Let's see. And he has unearthed a lot of really interesting 18th century and 19th century sash making tools. There's that chisel. Oops. There it is. Gosh, I'm used to that. Okay. And one of the coolest tools that he came up with, these are from two different joiner's chests from the 18th century. They're fixed pin gauges set to one shoulder the inside shoulder of the sash. Let's put this up here. There, marking this stuff out. That's the inside shoulder, sorry, where the molding is. And then, excuse me, the mortise, and then the outside. And that extra pin, I forget what Mr. Arnold says, but I think that's for the meeting rail in the middle on a quality sash. This one isn't. That meeting rail at the top would kick out, and the bottom sash would have a component that kicked in to make a lock when the sashes come together, if that makes sense. And that's what I think that extra pin is the extra thickness on the meeting rail. But those are craftsman made. And then this is also craftsman made. Look at that thing. Compared to the 18th century British joiners example, this was made by a shaker craftsman at Canterbury Shaker Village, if I remember correctly. It's got his initials on it. And it's also, like those other ones, set up to lay out two different sizes of window sash, two different thicknesses. in proportion to how large the sash is. I expect looking at it that it's extremely ergonomic and it's really a work of art. Oops. So, same place, all right. Those are your marking out tools. There's one other one that I just discovered. I've known about those others for a couple of years. And I've never seen one of these in person. This is a sash pricker. Has anybody ever seen one of these in person or documented anywhere? It's in John Whalen's book, which I have, The Wooden Plane, History, Form, and Function, which is an excellent volume for the whole topic of wooden planes. But it's got a chapter on sash making tools. He mentions this thing, and based on his description, I think he doesn't know any better than I do exactly how it's used, which may sound bold to say, but, or maybe he got it right and somebody else got it wrong. Let me see what he says. Basically, my thought looking at it at first was that it would be used to set out your marking gauge, an adjustable pin marking gauge, which were common by the period that these were being produced, so that you could scribe the joinery on your sashes. Please don't set things up for me. Thank you. When in fact, I believe what it's used for, there we are. Pardon me, John Whalen does know what it's for. There was another book that was unclear on it. So the 3 pins on one end lay out the shoulders and the center fillet of a glazing bar or a mud, which is really important when you're laying out these mortises here. I know from experience it's really easy to get those poorly located and then you don't have a square opening for your lights. Or if that mortise is too wide, that's the full width of the piece. So you make that too wide, you've got a sloppy fit. These tools, this little sash pricker, you can see that it's screwed to a piece of wood. That piece of wood is a plane made by Israel Wright in Pennsylvania. And he was one of the few makers who thought to screw the thing to the plane so that the craftsman wouldn't have such an easy time losing it, which is why we don't have as many as it's suspected were manufactured. They probably got lost, thrown away, whatever. But there's a few that were issued with the planes attached to them. And that's one of the examples I found on Facebook. I have to give blanket credit to a lot of people on Facebook who've been generous with their collections, and I've borrowed their images for this demonstration. So that sash picker, one end lays out the shoulders on the glazing bar and the fillet in the center. The other end lays out the distance from the fillet on the molding to the outside, which isn't always the same. Even though it's pretty convenient when it is, it's not always.
Was that just used by hand?
Yep. So you lay that out on your, this is my suspicion, based on John Whalen's description. That's not what I want. You would use that to mark where you're going to square across to cut out the mortises. Or to mark on your stock for your glazing bar where all those should go, so that when you're planing them, as we'll see in a moment once I haul out the sticking boards and get to planing these things, it's easy to get an inconsistent width on that fillet if you don't get the same pass every time. If you have that marked out with your marking gauge, it's easier to see whether you're all the way there. Let's see. There we are. So that was one of the examples of those things. I have a favorite example, which I also found on Facebook, which is this plane here. This is a sash coping plane, which I'll describe in more detail later. It's got the same open wedge for that flush fit to the iron that the Sill plane does, but it's for a different purpose. But this plane has the oddest feature. Can you all see that little cutout right there? That's a sliding lid cut into the plane body, and inside is a sash pricker set into the plane itself. That's the only time. I'm not the most experienced collector. So if I say something like, I've never seen one of these, this is the only one I've ever seen, it's the first time I've ever seen one. I'm 24 and I've only been doing this for 5 years. So that doesn't mean it's rare necessarily, but it's the first time I've ever seen a compartment cut into a plane. There's the pieces from that plane right there. So the sash pricker, a strange little layout tool that was almost lost to history, but for the foresight of these few craftsmen and manufacturers who thought to attach it to its companion tool. Not always a bad idea. Let's see. There's another odd layout tool for sash making. It's called a sash square. It's a marketing gimmick. It's a tiny little 3-inch square with a brass stock and a steel blade, and they weren't really made anymore after sometime in the 19th century or the 20th century. But it's just a square. It's a sash square in the catalog, but it's just a very small square. That was something I turned up. So that's laying out. All right. There's one other tool which I made for use in this project, making shop windows, which is a story stick. And this is not a specialized tool for sash making, but while I've known about story sticks for laying out cabinet work and joinery work, and I've seen them alluded to in sources, sash making was the first time I found an original document that explained how to make one and how to use one. And it was in this book right here, which was out of print for a very long time, and Richard Arnold found an old copy in his grandfather's tool chest, who had been a professional joiner, and he had it reprinted by Lost Art Press. So you might have seen an edition of this book if you're familiar with Lost Art Press and their publishing. But it's from very early in the 20th century, and it is full of illustrations, measurements, and instructions for laying out and joining. I know you can't see that back there, but they're measured drawings numbered with instructions for laying out sash work, door work, staircases, etc. And it tells you how to make one of these for a sash. So my story stick here, or layout rod, has, let's see, on one side, the mortises for the stiles on the sides of the sash, all laid out. And I can use my sash pricker to lay those out there on the story stick as well. I included the jam on my story stick because I knew I'd forget about that if I didn't. And then on the other side, that's my plow plane. Good. All right. On the other side, it's got the mortises and shoulders for the rails. So this helps me keep this thing square, laying it out exactly the same, top and bottom. No guesswork. You make this and you stick to it. All right. That's marking out. And this is the fun part. Making the moldings. This is what most of the specialized planes and tools and sash making have to do with, is making the moldings that characterize the sash on the inside face. I've used, pardon me, I'm not used to using one of these in a presentation at all. Okay. I used the classic ovalo molding in my sashes, which I enjoy. It's, to me, the most attractive, but there's some very interesting profiles out there. If you're not familiar with classical molding terminology, that's an ovalo right there. Is that little, there's a fillet, two fillets perpendicular to each other, and there's a quarter round connecting them, whether that's round or elliptical. But this is a sash shave made for an ovalo molding. we have sash planes. Not that one. That one is made for an oval molding. Well, I'm not sure where those are. Here we are. That's a very broad elliptical oval molding. So this right here is from someone else's collection. This is a set of molding and scribing tools for making sash. You have two planes with the same molding. They're numbered 1 and 2. And I was able to borrow from Bruce for the purposes of this demonstration a numbered pair with the same owner's mark from the same manufacturer of this molding. So that's one part of that set. And then you have these odd tools next to it. Sash templates. One of those is a half template, and the other is like this one, a double template. It's got the molding on both sides matched to the stick. These don't match because I made this with a different plane. I'll explain what that's for in a moment. Not included in this picture is the tool that you use with this template right here. And I do have a picture of that. There. This is a scribing gouge. That's the shoulder on the tang. It's cut off at the back. It's an octagonal bolster, just like you find on any early Sheffield chisel, but it's cut off on the back to fit into this extended handle. That may be difficult to see, but there we are. The handle extends on the back along the round back of the gouge up to about 1 inch from the tip. And that's an in-candle gouge, which means the bevel's on the inside, cuts flush on the outside. This is used in conjunction with the template to scribe the ends of the sash glazing bars where they overlap with the molding on the styles, if that makes sense. That set of tools there is, these usually come together. Now, the two planes, I'll explain those and then I'm going to demonstrate the process of using this plane, and I'll explain the different systems for creating moldings on sashes. Two planes with the exact same molding is a little odd. But the story there is one of those planes, it's suspected, is used to make a slightly finer cut than the other. And that's not in the shaping of the sole of the plane, that's in the setting, the tuning up of the plane. So you could have one that roughs out and one that finishes up to leave a finer surface. But that Sash Ovalo molding plane, excuse me, that's part of the English system of creating sash moldings. There's two ways to do this, and they're best illustrated on the glazing bar, the thinnest part of the sash. You need something to hold the board, which in this case is this shop-made sticking board. And that's going to hold that for several different cuts, different orientations of the piece. And then in the English system, you need two planes to generate the molding. The sash filletster, I'll pull up a picture of one of those. The sash filletster and the molding plane. Let's see here. Here's the molding plane. This is the plane I've got in my hand right now. I made this. It is the first attempt I made at making a molding plane. I got 90% of the way there, and I couldn't get the iron to line up with the sole. So that took me a minute to figure out. And ultimately, the final piece of the puzzle was the instruction of Todd Harley, who's a plane maker that some of us are familiar with. I was fortunate enough to take a class from him along with a few others, and we made a number 12 hollow, and he shared with me the knowledge I was missing on getting that iron to match up with the sole. So this thing finally cuts as of about 3 weeks ago. And the sole, there we are. The sole is an ovalo molding with pretty wide fillets. But I made that one to match another sash plane that I'm going to use in a different system of making moldings. But I'm making a pair of windows that I want to match. So I made the molding line up. And then the other plane, here we are, is a sash filister. If you're familiar with a filister plane, it's just a shoulder plane with a fence on it. It's a rabbit plane with an adjustable fence to control the width of the cut and to control the depth of the cut. This is a relatively early example. I suspect it's 19th century, but it's got some 18th century features. There's nothing extra on this thing at all. The only pieces of metal on it are the screws holding the fence to the arms and the iron itself. The depth stop is a friction fit piece of wood wedged in there. When I took this apart to clean it, I pulled out a couple of pine shavings that were stuck in there to keep it tight, and I don't know how long those have been there, but I put them back. And one of the arms warped, so it's a little sticky, but if you can see the sole there, let me open up the arms so you can see a little better. You may also be able to pull up a picture of the sole. There. That bright part is where I flattened the sole gently, as little as possible. And next to that, there's a rabbit cut into the sole of the plane. Because this plane, unlike a regular filister or a shoulder plane or a rabbit plane, cuts on the opposite side from the fence, right? You've got the fence on the adjustable arms. You've got the edge of the skewed iron in here on the shoulder. You've got the depth stop right there. This thing fits around sash bar. When I've woken it way up, but it fits over it like that. Let's see here. So we'll get that set up. But this is the English way, and this goes back to the early 18th century, mid 18th century, and carried on in English tradition well into the 19th and even the 20th centuries. They use two planes and they make four cuts, and that's how they make the moldings on these little glazing bars, which is different from the American method that emerged in the 18th century. And I'll discuss that after this demonstration. So, let's set up here. The sticking boards have to be different for those two operations. I have two sticking boards. I made one for each of the approaches. Because in the English system, you make 4 cuts. In the American system, you only make 2. Because Americans, historically, were in a pretty big hurry when it came to building houses. Okay. That's set. We can tighten up the wedges. Certain. That sticky arm is giving me trouble. There we go. Okay. So, I'm going to explain the sticking board real quick, and I'm going to pull up the images that show how this works. Bear with me, please. There it is. This is the English system. So we're going to start with the rabbits. On these glazing bars, looking at the rabbit on either side of that fillet, that's the outside. You're gonna set the glass on that shoulder inside each of the divided lights, and then you're gonna glaze it into pipe. On the inside, you've got the molding. So we're gonna start by making both rabbits, making the first cut with the bar this way in the sticking board, and we're gonna flip it over like that, that way, and make the second cut. And then we're gonna stick that fillet that we've created in the groove of the sticking board to hold the piece in place while we put the moldings on it. We're gonna make that cut twice, once on each side, just like we did the rabbit. Now for some real woodworking. The stops I'm using are flathead screws driven into the board and sharpened on top. I've got the rabbit in the board to keep the bar that way as I push in on the fence. There, so that's one shoulder. Now I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to step it up onto the side of that rabbit so that it stays flat. We're going to cut the rabbit on the other side. Now I could save myself a little time here if I made use of another tool that I learned about from Richard Arnold's posts, which is the bench knife. Traditionally, it's the tip of an eating knife, broken off, sharpened on two sides, and hammered into your workbench and the back of the piece you're planing on. English joiners weren't precious about their workbench tops. They were replaceable. So they would put nails or screws and nails into them. Early American joiners, honestly, were typically the same way based on my research. But I haven't tried that yet. Where that would save the time is I wouldn't have to take the plane off the piece to bring it back to the back side. I could pull it straight back and keep cutting. There we are. I don't know if you can see that very well at all, but that's the shoulders on two sides and fillet in the middle. Now we're going to flip it over and set it into our sticking board with that little center bar in the groove, butt it up against that screw. We're going to cut the moldings. Where's my molding plane? There it is. That's the same color as the shavings. All right. This plane's got a little bit of spring to it. Spring is the angle that you hold it over to get the correct molding while making use of the end of the iron. The next step is going to be to make another one of these that matches, make a pair, and try out using two of them. See whether there's anything to that number 1 and 2 nonsense. Here we are. Molding on one side. Now we're going to flip it over. This is why that groove is important, because now on the bottom we only have 3/8 of an inch bearing on the board, and I'm pushing down on the piece outboard of that, so it would just tip over and fly all over the place if it weren't for that groove. Almost there. This is southern yellow pine that I'm making these windows out of. And the friction from the sole of the plane is burning the pine right now. I can smell it. Unless something else is on fire. That's good enough. So that's finished glazing bar in 4 cuts with 2 planes in the English method. They were faster than I am. All the same, that was a bit of a process. So now, we're going to switch to the American method. This is a different sticking board. Instead of that piece built up on one side with a groove in it, this just has a piece a groove let in a little bit wider than the glazing bar, and then a stepped groove on the other side that lets the fillet on the side of the bar drop in along with the molding and lets that little bit right in the middle set on top, if that makes sense. So we're going to start with, in this method, our square piece. We're going to set it in that groove and plane the molding and the rabbet at the same time with the same plane. And then we're going to flip it over, put the molding side down with its rabbet in that groove, and we're going to do the same thing again. 2 cuts with 1 plane. The idea being that it's more efficient. Is it? I couldn't tell you. It is if I'm doing it, but like I said, I don't work as quickly or as competently as a formerly apprenticed British joiner in the 19th century. All right. Now I have photos of this plane so you can see it a little better. This is out of my collection. And I was really lucky to come across this plane just a few months ago while I was getting ready for this demonstration. They're not the rarest plane, but they're not the most common. Pardon me, I mentioned sash squares earlier. Just a square. It's got a nice little brass stock on it, but sash square, it's just a square. Where's my molding plane? This is what the British call a stick and rabbet plane, because it cuts the molding, or sticks the molding, and cuts the rabbet at the same time. In American sources, they're frequently just called sash planes because they were much more popular here than they were in England, and they were much more popular here than other sash planes were. Here we are. This is the plane that I've got on the bench right now. It has 2 stocks connected by 2 arms. Those arms are pinned into the stock on one side. And then you have a wedge, just like the wedges on the sash fillet or the plow plane, to tighten those together. I'll show you more examples, including one that I have here that I've borrowed from Bruce Cox of these double stock stick and rabbit planes. The reason there's 2 stocks, they're adjustable. You can put a shim in there and you can cut wider parts for thicker, heavier sashes. Some of them you just fix in place with no shim or a shim. Some of them are self-regulating, which means you don't need a shim. You got a system of screws and nuts that adjust it and hold the setting. There's the sole. Once again, you have this, pardon me, you have this ovalo molding, and that cuts the rabbit. So it's like a filister and a molding plane built into one tool. The middle there, you can see the irons. There's the molding iron that cuts the ovalo. There's the skewed iron that cuts the rabbit. And in the center, there's no cut. That's the stop. When it gets down to depth, you're done. There's the toe. That's a different tool. Okay. So this plane, in practice, we'll take our glazing bar, set it in that groove. I'm just going to set this right on top of that, get the molding lined up. As I said, there are many versions of this double stock adjustable sash plane with many different fixing mechanisms as an alternative to this pair of wedges. The thing that made this one a little rarer is the wedges. This is made by John Bell of Philadelphia sometime in the early 19th century. And the wedge ones aren't terribly common. I'll tell you why I think that is. It's a terrible mechanism. It doesn't hold its setting well at all. Let's see. I need to adjust the iron on this lever. Now we're getting somewhere. It may be age, it may be warping, but I found using this particular plane that I've about got to squeeze the stocks together to keep them hold their setting while I'm playing. Maybe not the best system. It looks cool. It's easier to make. Not the most convenient. We've almost completed the cut. So that's about the same amount of passes, roughly the same amount of passes as with the sash molding plane or with the filister. But in this case, it's both at the same time, and that's one side done. Now we can flip it over, set it in the sticking board, and repeat. Another benefit, I can go back a step. With this sticking board and this system, I realized that I maybe didn't finish one side well enough. I can flip it right back over and do the other side. There's a finished glazing bar. The way I'm doing it, much quicker than with that English system. It's less versatile, perhaps, depending on the plane that you're using. The earliest versions of these did not have 2 stocks that could separate. They were either 2 irons in one stock, or they're just a single iron with a really wide molding, or profile, I should say, that cut that thing. But there it is right there. So those are generally referred to as the English method and the American method of sticking moldings and rabbets on glazing bars and sash parts. I do like using one of these planes. Fairly early in my time at Conner Prairie, I've been there for about 3 years, and we do our own historic maintenance. So pretty early on, with a background in furniture making and with some time spent noodling around with hand tools, I was asked to make replacement window sashes, which I was very intimidated by at the time. And that was the tool that I used. And it was using that plane, not that exact plane, but that type of plane, that adjustable sash plane, that made it way more fun and way less intimidating. It went from, oh boy, these are these terrifying, precise things that need to be made perfectly. It's got to fit perfectly. It's got to move perfectly. You know, it has to be square so the glass fits perfectly. And it was pretty nerve-wracking setting it up, and then I went to use one of those things and realized half the work was being done for me by the tool. It was pretty great. So, let's see. I demonstrated the fillet stir, sash fillet stir. That's the plainest example you could get. There's no nicking iron to score the grain. It's a, let's see here. It throws the shavings onto the bench. It's got that friction depth stop. Bare bones, absolutely the least features you can have in a sash fillet stir. At the other end of the spectrum, we have this Scottish example, which I also have with me. Bruce was generous to lend me for this demonstration a good handful of sash making tools. Some of them are really exquisite examples. So if you collect sash making tools, talk to Bruce. But this piece right here, who is this? D. Mullock in Perth, looks like the maker, sold by Adam Stark in Edinburgh. This is a combination fillet stir. So a sash fillet stir generally cannot be used in place of a moving fillet stir, a standard fillet stir. This one can, because it's got a scoring iron on both sides and a depth stop on both sides. And where this is bare bones, this has all the fittings. It's got a, let me pull up the picture so everybody can see. It's got a fully boxed sole. That is 2 gigantic solid pieces of end grain boxwood that have shrunk just a little bit along the length, but otherwise just beautifully fit in those dovetails. And it's got steel soles welded onto the depth stops. Not welded, sorry. Brazed and pinned, perhaps. Brazed, thank you, Bruce. There's little pins going all the way through as well. Belt suspenders there. There they are. There's the 2 ovalo planes from earlier. If you couldn't see those when I held them up earlier in the back, there's the pair that I had out. So that combination fillet stir is a fairly rare tool because it was much more expensive and not entirely necessary, but if you had one, you'd find it pretty handy because you could cut rabbets on the outside or on the inside of the piece you cut. What else do we have here? Should have pictures of this as well. This is a user-made double stock adjustable sash plane. And this one's interesting because, for one thing, it's made out of some kind of curly fruit wood. Apple, perhaps. Or scroll. That's good enough. And it doesn't have wedges, it doesn't have wooden screws, it doesn't have brass screws set in the collar. It's just screwed together with standard round head wood screws. That's the plane right there. Certainly craftsman made. Let's see. And then one of the finest examples of adjustable sash plane technology is the E.W. Carpenter patent sash plane, which a lot of plane collectors are already going to be familiar with. Here's a view from the top. It's a different plane. Looking at the top there, you can see that's the end of the screw. So that is one piece with the threaded rod, and that's one solid piece of rosewood, I think, and that's the nut right there. And then above each screw, they're set in a keeper. So this is one of those planes that was self-regulating. Seat irons, and let's see here. There it is. There. It's a beautiful tool. That's the E.W. Carpenter patent. Let's see. Then we get into even wilder territory with sash planes. The Scottish had their own method of making sashes. This, by the way, is also an E.W. Carpenter patent with the screws and nuts. Scottish sash planes cut an entirely different approach. There's a glass check plane, is what it's called too. It's a grooving plane, and it cuts both rabbets at the same time from the outside of the glazing bar. And then there are Scottish sash molding planes. These are some of the craziest examples of plane making, I think, that are out there. Maybe not, but they're pretty wild. This is out of Jane Reese's article. 2, 3, and 4 iron planes in one stock with pierced escapements cut into the sides. And it may be blurry, but you can see there the Gothic profile, which is very popular apparently in Scottish as well as in British joinery. I have some better pictures of the soles of some of these Gothic planes. But those Scottish planes, the profile is so complex and changes in its angle of attack so dramatically that it takes multiple irons to get an efficient cut and eject shavings properly. They don't seem to be very popular at all outside of Scotland, probably because I imagine they're a royal pain to adjust the irons. And I am not finding images of the planes. I apologize. When I was curating this collection of images last night, looks like some of them didn't make it into this folder. Maybe we'll go back to the article and find some examples there. Well, here are some examples of different styles, and this is one of the Gothic style profiles that are popular with the pointed top. So that covers the planes we're using making the moldings and the rabbets on both the frame pieces of the sash and the glazing bars. Now to join those all together, we've already laid out the mortises. We've already made all the moldings on our pieces that were cut out to size. Now we encounter a problem joining the pieces together. I'm actually going to go back into that article. With those moldings, they've got to meet the outside of the frame somehow. And there we are. Now this is showing a way to overlap the tenons of the glazing bars inside another glazing bar to get a strong joint. But what I'd like you to look at here is how the tenon matches the fillet on the middle of the bar, in between the molding and the rabbet. And then the molding is coped one piece over the other. And I've done that with a coping saw. It's pretty rough. I've done it with a standard in-cannel gouge, which is a bit of a trick, but that is where the sash coping plane and the coping gouge come in. So this diagram shows the coping plane in use. You can see how this example is set up to the angle of spring that I talked about earlier, how far you hold the plane over to make the most of the end of the iron. It's pretty dramatic on this one. And speaking with Todd Harley about plane making, he describes to me how difficult it is to get that flush cut on the outside just right, and also to set it up so you can sharpen that iron over time and retain that cut. It's a really tricky thing to get lined up when you're grinding the iron to fit the plane sole. I have some examples of scribing planes. And I find Pennsylvania planes with different kinds of boxing very interesting. That's actually not a Pennsylvania plane, my apologies, but there's some intermittent boxing, which was popular among Pennsylvania plane makers, like Wright and others. And then some of these sash scribing planes have some very nice boxed soles. I have to apologize. These images were in order, and there were more of them, and I'm not sure what happened in translation, but there we are. There's the boxed sole. That goes all the way, and down here you can see that cutout with the flat for the fillet and the cove for one piece to go over the other. This is from Shinneman. There's the plane right there. Here's an example with a rosewood boxed sole from Henry G. White, Philadelphia. And then of course the chisel that we talked about earlier. Gouge, pardon me. The coping gouge. All right. Excuse me. The other way to match up one piece to another, and I'll show you hopefully what I've done on this sash. It's pretty easy to scribe or cope the bars over the molding on the frame pieces, but then at the corners you've got to do something a little different. You want to keep it simple. you can use the coping plane on the end grain of the stiles or rails to cope one piece over the other, but then you've got it cut out on the other piece. You got to plane the molding all the way across. That's an option, and it was done, and that's how it's done with machines. But the way I learned, which is often done on early sashes, is a partial miter. So I've got the tenon extending through the piece, and then the molding itself is mitered on top of the tenon. One piece sort of overlaps the other. And I apologize, it's kind of difficult to describe, and I don't have pictures of that joint right there. But in mitering one piece to another, a miter template comes in handy, and some of those were similar to the scribing templates. There's a miter template. The angled cut on one end that fits over the molding, so you cut that molding nice and clean, either with the saw lined up on the end of the template or just pushing the chisel down on the end. And here's a illustration of how to clamp the template on so you can make that angled cut into the molding there. Let me see. I think so I'm going to get further into the many variations of adjustable sash molding planes, but those are some of the images that got jettisoned somewhere. And I have a very limited collection, but I'll share with you an interesting revelation from some people who've been researching into 18th century planes, which is that it's been a consensus for a while. I'll wrap up with this. It's been a consensus for a while that the double iron or single iron combined stick and rabbit plane was either an American invention or at the very least took hold in America almost immediately upon its invention sometime in the mid to late 18th century. And here eclipsed the double plane system. Historically, Americans have much preferred a single plane to cut the stick in rabbit to a pair of planes to cut the molding in the rabbit. I got curious, and others have been curious before me, of what was the earliest example of an American-made stick and rabbit plane. And it's not an adjustable plane, it's not a self-regulating plane, it's just one iron in one stock that cuts the stick and rabbit at the same time. One of the earliest examples of this form is actually a bench plane sized stock with a toe and a striking iron. This is by John Sleeper, who was an early American plane maker. And he would take bench plane irons and cut them in half and then make them into the stick and rabbit moldings. And this iron right here actually has the James cam mark cut right in half across the two irons. So that's an early example, but there is a handful of examples that are even earlier that are just a standard molding plane. And the interesting thing about one of those came to my attention in an article in Mortise and Tenon magazine written by Steve Voigt, who's another excellent contemporary plane maker. And he's talking about Caesar Celler, who is one of the earliest American plane makers. Caesar Celler was enslaved to Francis Nicholson, who worked in Rantham is how my New England friend told me it was pronounced, Massachusetts. It may not be how it's pronounced, but Francis Nicholson living in Rantham, that's a famous mark to plane makers. That's the earliest named documented American plane maker. And Caesar Celler, who was formerly enslaved to him, took over his business, or at least carried on his business under his own name, and was incredibly prolific. Made just a ton of planes that are still out there with the Caesar Celler mark. Caesar Celler's sash plane is one of the earliest dated examples of an American stick and rabbit plane. Caesar Celler one of the two earliest American planemakers and one of the few documented named African American planemakers working under his own name. Steve Voigt postulated that he may have been the one to invent the stick and rabbit molding plane. We don't know, but it's a possibility, and it's a fascinating piece of plane-making history. That's a quintessentially American story. A foreign artisan who passed on his trade to an individual that he enslaved, who carried on under his own name and made a career for himself that still is one of the most prolific plane-making careers in early American history, and was one of the plane makers to pioneer a uniquely American technology for producing sash windows in our growing nation. I hope you enjoyed my destruction of pieces of wood and blurry pictures of old tools. But sash making beyond the tools is a passion of mine, because I was talking at the beginning about the inherent sustainability and repairability of wooden window sashes. If you are a plane maker or a plane collector or a plane user, or just plain crazy, thank you. I can't recommend diving down this rabbit hole enough. Even with the things that I wasn't able to include, there's just an entire world of sash making tools, and most of them are planes, beyond what I've shared today. So, thank you.